The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as 8-year-old Princess Charlotte walked alongside her nanny through the royal gardens. It was a Tuesday in late spring. The young princess had requested to take her usual morning walk before her private lessons began. Charlotte loved these quiet moments, when she could observe the daily workings of the castle without the usual formality that surrounded royal events. As they approached the main courtyard, Charlotte noticed something unusual happening near the ceremonial guard post. A small crowd had gathered, and there seemed to be some kind of disturbance. The princess slowed her pace, her curiosity getting the better of her. She had always been fascinated by the royal guards in their magnificent red uniforms and tall black hats, standing so perfectly still for hours at a time from where she stood. Charlotte could see one of the guards at his post, maintaining his traditional stance despite what appeared to be growing chaos around him. A group of tourists had surrounded him, and their behavior was becoming increasingly inappropriate. They were shouting loudly, trying to get the guard to break his composure, making silly faces, and even attempting to touch his uniform and ceremonial rifle. The guard, whose name was James Morrison, had been serving the royal family for over 5 years. He took immense pride in his duty and had never once broken protocol during his service. But today was testing every ounce of his professional training. The tourists were becoming more aggressive, with one man actually trying to knock off his bearskin hat while others laughed and took photos. Charlotte watched in growing concern. She saw sweat beginning to form on the guard's face. She knew from her royal education that the guards were trained never to react, never to speak, and never to abandon their posts, regardless of what happened around them. But she could see that this situation was becoming dangerous and deeply unfair. To the dedicated soldier, her nanny tried to guide her away from the scene, suggesting they take a different path to avoid the commotion. But Charlotte stood firm, her young mind already formulating a plan. She had been taught about duty, respect, and standing up for what was right. As she watched the harassment continue, she knew she couldn't simply walk away and pretend she hadn't witnessed this injustice. The crowd was growing larger, with more tourists joining in what they seemed to think was harmless fun. One woman was trying to make the guards smile by making exaggerated facial expressions, while her husband attempted to get a selfie by pressing close to the stoic soldier. A group of teenagers had started a game of trying to make him blink, shouting increasingly loud comments and waving their hands in front of his face. Charlotte's heart raced as she realized that none of the adults around seemed willing to intervene. The castle staff who were nearby appeared uncertain about how to handle the situation without causing an international incident with the tourists. Security personnel were approaching, but they were still several minutes away, and Charlotte could see that the guard's composure was being pushed to its absolute limit. The young princess took a deep breath and made a decision that would surprise everyone present. Despite her nanny's gentle protests, she stepped forward toward the crowd, her small chin lifted with determination. She had been raised to understand her responsibility to protect those who served her family, and she wasn't going to let protocol prevent her from doing what she knew was right as she approached the chaotic scene. Charlotte's mind was clear about what needed to be done. She had watched her parents and grandparents handle difficult situations with grace and authority, and now it was time for her to apply those lessons. The 8-year-old princess was about to teach a group of adults a lesson about respect, dignity, and the true meaning of royal duty. Princess Charlotte walked purposefully toward the crowd, her small frame somehow commanding attention despite her young age. The tourists were so focused on their harassment of the guard that they didn't immediately notice the approaching child. Charlotte positioned herself strategically between the most aggressive tourists and Guard Morrison, her presence creating an unexpected buffer. "Excuse me," Charlotte said in her clear, well-educated voice, loud enough for everyone in the immediate area to hear. The crowd gradually became aware of the young girl standing among them, though most had no idea who she was. Her simple but elegant clothing and confident manner suggested she wasn't just any ordinary child. But her identity remained. It's unknown to the tourists. One of the men who had been trying to knock off the guard's hat turned toward Charlotte with irritation. "Move along, little girl," he said dismissively. We're just having some fun with the tin soldier here." His friends laughed at the comment, clearly thinking themselves clever for their disrespectful behavior. Charlotte's eyes flashed, with a quiet anger that would have been recognizable to anyone familiar with the Windsor family temperament. She stood a little straighter and looked directly at the man who had spoken. "This soldier is not a toy for your entertainment," she said firmly. "He is a member of the Queen's Guard, and he deserves your respect, not your harassment." The crowd began to murmur, surprised by the articulate and authoritative response from someone so young. A woman with a camera lowered her phone and looked more closely at Charlotte. There was something about the child's bearing and the way she spoke that seemed oddly familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. "Who are you to tell us what to do?" asked another tourist, a teenage boy who had been waving his hands in front of the guard's face. "It's just a bit of fun. He's paid to stand there and take it." Charlotte's response was swift and pointed. "He's paid to guard this castle and protect the people inside it. He is not paid to be humiliated by people who should know better." Her voice carried a natural authority that seemed far beyond her years, and several people in the crowd began to look uncomfortable. Guard Morrison, still maintaining his rigid posture and staring straight ahead, felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. In his 5 years of service, no one had ever stood up for him like this during such an incident. He couldn't see exactly who was speaking, but the voice was young and filled with genuine indignation on his behalf. An older woman in the crowd stepped forward, looking more closely at Charlotte. "You speak very well for such a young child," she said, her tone slightly less hostile than the others. "But surely you understand that people are curious about the guards. It's part of the tourist experience." Charlotte shook her head emphatically. "And curious is perfectly fine. Taking photos from a respectful distance is acceptable. But surrounding someone, touching them, trying to knock off their hat, and treating them like they're not human is not curiosity, it's bullying." The word bullying seemed to hit several people in the crowd hard. Some of the adults began to look ashamed, perhaps recognizing that their behavior was indeed inappropriate. A few stepped back, creating more space. Around the guard post, however, the man who had initially dismissed Charlotte wasn't ready to back down. "Listen, kid. You don't understand how the world works. These guards are just for show. They're like living statues. It's not like we're hurting anyone." Charlotte's response would later be remembered by everyone present as the moment when her true character shone through. Every person deserves dignity regardless of their job. This man has chosen to serve his country with honor. The least you can do is show him basic human respect. The conviction in her voice and the maturity of her words began to have a profound effect on the crowd. More people started stepping back, and some began to look genuinely embarrassed by their earlier behavior. But Charlotte wasn't finished yet. She had more to say that would completely transform the situation. As the crowd continued to murmur and several people began backing away, Charlotte noticed that her nanny was approaching with what appeared to be a member of the castle's protocol staff. She knew she had only moments left before she would be guided away from the situation, so she decided to make her most important point. "I want you all to imagine something," Charlotte said, raising her voice slightly to ensure everyone could hear her clearly. "Imagine that this guard is your father, or your brother, or your son. Imagine that he's standing here doing his job with honor and dedication, and a group of strangers decides to mock him and treat him like he's not even human." The crowd fell notably quieter as her words sank in. Charlotte continued, "This man has a family who loves him, he has friends who respect him, his dreams and feelings just like all of you. But right now, you're treating him like he's nothing, more than a piece of furniture that you can poke and prod for your own amusement." A middle-aged woman near the front of the crowd looked visibly moved by Charlotte's words. She turned to her husband and whispered something that made him nod and step further back from the guard post. The teenage boy who had been waving his hands in the guard's face now looked down at his feet. Clearly uncomfortable, Charlotte took a small step closer to Guard Morrison, positioning herself even more protectively in front of him. "This soldier serves with honor every single day. He stands here for hours in all weather, protecting the people and traditions that make this place special. He deserves your admiration, not your mockery." The man who had been most aggressive earlier was beginning to realize that this was no ordinary child. Her accent, her vocabulary, her natural authority, everything about her suggested she was someone of significance. "Who exactly are you?" he asked, his tone now more curious than confrontational. Before Charlotte could answer, her nanny finally reached the group, slightly out of breath from hurrying across the courtyard. "Your Royal Highness," she said quietly, hoping to discreetly guide Charlotte away from the situation. But her words carried in the quiet that had fallen over the crowd. The effect was immediate and dramatic. "Royal Highness?" someone whispered. "Your Royal Highness?" The crowd began to buzz with sudden realization and excitement. Phones came out again, but this time they were pointed at Charlotte rather than the guard. Charlotte felt a moment of frustration that her identity had been revealed, but she quickly realized this might actually help her cause. She straightened her shoulders and looked around the crowd with the same direct gaze she had learned from watching her grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth. "Yes," she said simply. "I am Princess Charlotte. And this man," she gestured toward Guard Morrison, "serves my family with dedication and honor. When you disrespect him, you disrespect everyone he represents and protects." The transformation in the crowd was remarkable. People who had been laughing and jeering just minutes earlier now looked mortified. Several actually took off their hats or bowed slightly, unsure of the proper protocol, but wanting to show respect. "Your Royal Highness," stammered the woman who had been trying to make the guard smile. "We had no idea. We were just ... we thought it was harmless fun." Schle's response showed wisdom far beyond her 8 years. "Whether I was here or not shouldn't matter. This soldier deserves respect because he's a human being doing an important job, not because a princess is watching." The crowd was now completely silent, hanging on every word from the young royal. Even the protocol staff member who had arrived with the nanny seemed impressed by how Charlotte was handling the situation. "I hope," Charlotte continued, "that you'll remember this moment and think about how you treat people who are working to serve others. Kindness and respect cost nothing, but they mean everything to the person receiving them." The man who had been most dismissive earlier stepped forward, and in a gesture that surprised everyone, including himself, bowed deeply to both Charlotte and the guard. "Your Royal Highness, you're absolutely right. We apologize for our behavior." The apology seemed to break a dam of emotion in the crowd. One by one, other tourists began stepping forward to offer their own apologies. The teenage boy who had been making faces at the guard looked genuinely ashamed as he spoke up. "Really? Sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think about how it would feel to be him." Charlotte nodded graciously at each apology, but she could see that Guard Morrison was still maintaining his rigid posture. Staring straight ahead as his training demanded, she knew that despite the positive turn in the situation, the soldier couldn't acknowledge what was happening or show any reaction to the apologies being offered. "I'd like you all to understand something important about these guards," Charlotte said, her voice taking on an educational tone. "They undergo months of intensive training to serve in this position. They must stand perfectly still for hours at a time in blazing heat and freezing cold, rain and snow. They cannot speak, they cannot move, and they cannot defend themselves against harassment." The crowd listened intently as Charlotte continued her impromptu lesson. "This makes them vulnerable, and that's exactly why they deserve our protection and respect, not our torment. They sacrifice their comfort and even their dignity to serve their country and protect others." A woman near the back of the crowd raised her hand tentatively, as if she were in a classroom. "Your Royal Highness, is there a proper way to appreciate the guards without being disrespectful?" Charlotte smiled at the question, pleased that people were genuinely interested in learning. "Of course there is. You can watch from a respectful distance. You can take photos without getting too close or trying to touch them. You can teach your children about the history and importance of the guard. And most importantly, you can simply observe quietly and appreciate their dedication." The protocol staff member who had arrived with Charlotte's nanny stepped forward and whispered something to the nanny, who nodded. Charlotte could see that she would need to wrap up the situation soon, but she had one more important point to make. "I want to tell you something about this particular guard," Charlotte said, though she realized she didn't actually know Guard Morrison's name or personal details. But she knew enough about the guards in general to speak meaningfully about their service. "He has stood at this post countless times, protecting not just the physical buildings, but the history and traditions they represent. He has never once failed in his duty, never once abandoned his post, never once compromised the dignity of his position. Guard Morrison felt his eyes briefly moisten at the young princess's words. In all his years of service, he had never experienced such a public acknowledgement of his dedication and sacrifice. He remained perfectly still. But inside, he felt a profound sense of gratitude and renewed pride in his service. Charlotte turned to address the guard directly, even though she knew he couldn't respond. "Thank you for your service," she said clearly. "Thank you for your dedication and your sacrifice. You represent the very best of what it means to serve others." The entire crowd seemed to hold its breath during this moment. Several people were visibly moved, with some wiping away tears. The dignity and sincerity of the young princess's words had transformed what began as a scene of harassment into a moment of genuine respect and appreciation. "Now," Charlotte said, turning back to the tourists, "I hope you'll spread the word about what you've learned today. Tell other visitors about the proper way to appreciate and respect the guards. Help us create an environment where these dedicated soldiers can serve with the dignity they deserve." The crowd began to disperse naturally, with many people approaching Charlotte to thank her for opening their eyes to their inappropriate behavior. But Charlotte wasn't quite finished yet. She had one more gesture planned that would complete her intervention in a way that would be remembered for years to come. As the crowd continued to disperse, Charlotte made a decision that surprised even her own nanny. Instead of leaving with the departing tourists, she positioned herself about 6 feet in front of Guard Morrison and stood at attention herself. Her small back was straight, her hands clasped behind her, and her chin held high with determination. The remaining tourists stopped in their tracks, confused and intrigued by what the young princess was doing. Her nanny approached carefully, unsure whether to interrupt what was clearly a deliberate action by Charlotte. "Your Royal Highness," the nanny whispered, "what are you doing?" Charlotte spoke without moving from her position, her voice carrying clearly in the now quiet courtyard. "If this guard must stand alone and undefended against harassment, then he won't stand alone today. I'm going to stand guard with him." The symbolic gesture sent ripples of emotion through everyone present. The tourists who had been preparing to leave found themselves staying to witness this extraordinary display of solidarity. Several pulled out their phones again, but this time to capture what they recognized as a truly historic moment. Guard Morrison, still maintaining his professional composure, was deeply moved by the princess's gesture. In all his years of training and service, nothing had prepared him for this moment. The 8-year-old member of the royal family he was sworn to protect was now standing guard to protect him. Charlotte remained perfectly still, mimicking the guard's posture as best she could. Minutes passed in respectful silence as tourists, staff, and even some castle workers who had heard about the incident gathered at a respectful distance to observe. The protocol staff member, Lo Oked, uncertain about how to handle this unprecedented situation. On one hand, it was highly irregular for a member of the royal family to stand guard. On the other hand, Princess Charlotte's actions were demonstrating exactly the kind of leadership and compassion that the royal family was meant to represent. After about 10 minutes of standing together, Charlotte finally spoke, still maintaining her position. "This is what solidarity looks like," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "When someone is serving others and facing unfair treatment, we don't just walk away, we stand with them." A woman in the crowd began to clap slowly, and soon others joined in. The applause wasn't loud or disruptive, but it was sustained and genuinely appreciative. Even some of the castle staff who had gathered were participating in this spontaneous show of respect. Charlotte finally turned slightly toward the crowd, though she maintained her basic position. "I hope that whenever you see someone being treated unfairly, you'll remember this moment. Remember that even a princess can stand guard when it's the right thing to do." The educational moment continued as Charlotte explained her actions. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply stand beside someone who needs support. We don't always have to use big words or make grand gestures. Sometimes presence is enough. Her nanny approached again, this time with a gentle smile on her face. She had realized that trying to cut short this lesson in leadership and compassion would be inappropriate. Instead, she positioned herself nearby, ready to assist if needed, but clearly proud of her young charge's instincts. After standing guard for nearly 20 minutes total, Charlotte finally relaxed her posture slightly. She turned toward Guard Morrison, knowing he couldn't acknowledge her directly, spoke in a voice that carried both respect and warmth. "Your service is seen, it's appreciated, and it matters," she said simply. "You are not invisible, and you are not alone." The crowd had grown during Charlotte's vigil, with word spreading throughout the castle about what was happening. Among the new arrivals were several off-duty guards who had come to witness their colleague being honored by a member of the royal family. Charlotte noticed the other guards in the crowd and had an inspiration for her final gesture. As she turned to address them directly, "Would the other guards present please join me for a moment?" 3 off-duty guards stepped forward, clearly moved by the request. Charlotte asked them to form a small circle around Guard Morrison's post, creating a symbolic shield of protection and support. The 3 off-duty guards formed a respectful circle around Guard Morrison's post, creating a powerful image of solidarity and brotherhood. Charlotte stood with them, the youngest member of this impromptu honor guard, but clearly its inspiration. "And leader is what we should see every day," Charlotte announced to the gathered crowd. "People supporting those who serve others, people standing up for what's right, and people treating each other with dignity and respect." The moment was captured by dozens of phones and cameras, but the atmosphere remained respectful and reverent, rather than intrusive. Even the tourists who had initially been harassing the guard were now standing quietly, many with tears in their eyes as they witnessed this lesson in humanity and leadership. After a few more minutes, Charlotte nodded to the off-duty guards, who stepped back with crisp salutes to their colleague. She then approached as close to Guard Morrison as protocol would allow and spoke her final words to him directly. "Thank you for showing me what real courage looks like," she said. "Your dignity in the face of adversity is something I will never forget, and it's something I hope to emulate throughout my life." As Charlotte finally prepared to leave with her nanny, spontaneous applause broke out again from the crowd. But this time it was directed not just at the princess, but at Guard Morrison as well. The tourists had learned to appreciate the soldier's service, and they wanted him to know it. Even if he couldn't acknowledge their appreciation directly, the man who had been most aggressive earlier approached Charlotte one final time. "Your Royal Highness," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you've taught us something today that we'll never forget. Thank you for showing us how to be better people." Charlotte smiled graciously and shook his offered hand. "We all make mistakes," she said with wisdom far beyond her years. "What matters is that we learn from them and do better next time." As the crowd finally began to disperse for good, many people stopped to take respectful photos of Guard Morrison from an appropriate distance. Some left small tokens of respect near his post, flowers, thank you notes, and even a few small flags. The harassment had been transformed into genuine appreciation and respect. Word of princess? Charlotte's intervention spread rapidly throughout the castle and beyond. By evening, the story was being shared on social media around the world, with videos of the young princess standing guard alongside the soldier touching millions of hearts. Guard Morrison completed his shift that day with a renewed sense of pride and purpose. When he was finally relieved of duty, his replacement whispered quietly, "You've become quite famous today, James. The princess herself stood guard with you." For the first time in hours, James Morrison allowed himself a small smile. He had served the royal family for 5 years, but today a member of that family had served him. It was a moment that would define not just his career, but his entire understanding of what true leadership looked like. Princess Charlotte returned to her regular activities, but news of her compassionate intervention continued to spread. Incident became a defining moment in her young life, demonstrating the values of courage, compassion, and standing up for others. That would shape her future role in the royal family. The tourists who had witnessed the event returned to their home countries with a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. More importantly, they carried with them a lesson about treating all people with dignity and respect, regardless of their position or ability to defend themselves. Years later, Guard Morrison would often be asked about the day Princess Charlotte stood guard with him. His answer was always the same. She taught me that true nobility isn't about titles or crowns. It's about having the courage to do what's right, even when you're the smallest person in the room.